Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you so much to RAPS for hosting us today. I'm Dr. Suzanne Minton. I'm a Director of Content Strategy at Certara, and I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Anaya, you can turn on your camera whenever you're ready. Anaya Ryman is a transparency specialist too at Certara. She has over a decade of experience in healthcare, academic research, and the pharmaceutical industry. She is a subject matter expert for our clinical trial transparency and disclosure team. Anaya, welcome to today's event. I'll now turn it over to you to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Suzanne, for a lovely introduction. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. So the topic for today's discussion is EU CTR challenges drug developers have faced in the first 6 months. So without further preamble, I'm going to jump right into the agenda for today. So I understand there might be still colleagues in the industry who are still new to this regulation. So I'm going to spend a first few couple minutes on what the EU CTR is, what the regulation entails, what is the scope in terms of the documents. When we talk about documents, we talk about transparency and disclosure activities as well. So we're going to discuss that. And what were the challenges that we faced this year since it went live earlier this year, since January of 2022. So we're going to...
No, sorry to interrupt. I was just gonna say, if you're not sharing your slides yet.
I started sharing. Sorry about that. So again, going over the agenda. So I'm going to start with what the overview is on clinical trial regulation, what the scope is in terms of when we talk about the documents. And of course, when we talk about the documents, we talk about transparency and disclosure activities that go side by side. And then the challenges that we faced. We, as a transparency and disclosure service provider, we were able to mitigate a few of those challenges. So what were the tips and tricks that worked for us, the tips and tricks of the trade that we learned along the way? I'm going to share that at the end. So before I begin with the overview, few updates on where EU CTR stands as of earlier this month. So as of November the 1st, we saw that 100 clinical trials were authorized, out of which 82 are available on the CTIS platform for public viewing. And we see that majority of the clinical trials were approved. A point to note here is that this year was a transition year, so application through the CTIS platform was optional, was voluntary. There could be CTA applications through the clinical trial directive as well during this year. So what exactly is the regulation? What really is EU CTR? So the EU clinical trial regulation, it replaces the older EU clinical trial directive, the online platform of CTIS, Clinical Trial Information System, or CTIS for short. It replaces the UDRIS-CT. It came into effect on 31st of January 2022. That's when it went live. And this year, it's a voluntary submission for new CTA applications beginning in January 2023. All new submission clinical trial applications need to be done through the CTIS system. And then the transition period ends in January of 2025. So if there are any trials that are going to end by January of 2025, they can continue to run. Nothing changes for them. They can still submit documents through the UDRIS-CT. But if there are any trials that are going to continue beyond 2025, January 31st, those are the trials that would need to be transferred because that's the end of the transition period, and the trials under the directive cannot continue after that time. So the main objective of having this transition period is for sponsors and member states, as well as the EMA, to learn to sort of navigate the way and adapt to the new regulation, to identify issues, because there've been significant challenges that we faced this past year on while using the CTIS platform. So that was the purpose of this transition year, and beyond 2023, it's going to be compulsory for all CTA applications to go through CTIS. So what the regulation aims to do, it aims to harmonize clinical trials throughout the European Union or the European Economic Area member states. It simplifies the application of CTAs. It establishes simplified approach to submission, assessment, and reporting of clinical trials within the European Union. There's a much more, in contrast to what we had before, it is a much more simplified end-to-end electronic application process throughout the life cycle of a clinical trial. Previously, stakeholders had to submit, if a trial is running in multiple countries, stakeholders had to submit separate applications for each country. Now it's a single CTA application across all member states, which has obviously made the process more efficient. It's faster authorization of trials now. And of course, because trials are available on the platform fairly early on, there's increased transparency for data sharing. CTIS offers like searchable documents. There's searchable information for patients, for healthcare professionals, just for general public. Information is available as technical summary as well as layperson summaries. So because of that increased transparency, the hope is that that would also increase patient recruitment and overall improve the data that's available. Something to note here is that from a transparency point of view, transparency and disclosure activities were prior to this regulation not necessary right at the beginning. They were more so towards the end when the clinical trial was published on the UTRCT. Now there are more so transparency activities are more involved right from the beginning. So when we talk about documents being on the CTIS platform, the scope of the documents for a typical CTA application, the documents are going to be in two parts. So the part one documents are pan-European documents. They are assessed by a reporting member state on behalf of all other member states in collaboration with the other member states. And then there are country-specific documents which are going to be assessed by each member state separately. So when we talk about pan-European documents or the part one, they are the cover letter, the clinical trial protocol, synopsis, and then the medicinal product related documents such as the IV investigator's brochure or the IMPD, as well as the data safety monitoring board charter and the financial arrangements. When we talk about country-specific documents, those are the proof of payments, proof of insurance, suitability of investigators, suitability of facilities, and then consent forms. And of course, throughout the life cycle, we have the other documents that are the report bodies and the results and clinical trial-related, safety-related documents, etc., that they're going to follow throughout the course of the clinical trial. So sponsors would need to submit two versions of each document. So there's a for publication version. The name signifies it's going to be published on the portal on the CTIS platform, and then there's a not for publication version. The requirement to provide document version for publication or not for publication depends on the type of document and what content it has. Like, does it have protected personal information, or does it have commercially confidential information or CCIs? We can for any mandatory clinical trial documents, we can either go for a deferral strategy, or we can go ahead and use transparency techniques that I'm going to mention in the following couple of slides. Needless to say, personal data cannot be definitely needs to be anonymized and CCI needs to be removed. However, one thing I'll mention here is the version that is not for publication will have the CCIs intact in them for member states to make their assessment. So we talk about the documents being in the public. Of course, transparency is a big part of it. Documents are going to be made public at the first opportunity unless they're deferred. According to the guidance, that's the draft guidance that we've been provided by EMA for the CTIS and EU CTR. It states that the versions of documents for publication should not contain any personal data. So essentially, CTIS should be viewed by sponsors as something which is a source of public information. It has information right from the beginning of the trial till the end of the trial. There are two categories of information that's exempt from disclosure. One is personal data and the other is CCI. Of course, we've seen this in policy 70 as well. Sponsors need to ensure that no PPD or CCI is made public. Of course, it can result in data breaches if it is. It can result in fines under the GDPR if from authorities if data is leaked out, and of course it can cause a financial loss to sponsors as well. A redaction strategy or an anonymization strategy or a deferral strategy can be used for depending on if the documents can be deferred. A point to highlight, the onus is on the sponsors to ensure that a correct strategy is chosen, and of course the data is patient privacy and patient confidentiality is maintained. Lastly, there are a few items that are not exempt from disclosure, like the name of the clinical investigator, the address, the status of compliance, and the sponsor legal representative details. So the first category of data, the personal data or the protected personal data, PPD for short. There are two kinds of identifiers that we use that we need to anonymize. The first is direct identifiers. Direct is any attribute that on its own can uniquely identify a data subject. The second category is indirect identifiers. Indirect is any attribute that in combination with other attributes can identify a person if there is sufficient background information that's available. So example of direct would be subject ID, names. Indirect would be demographics, weight, height, gender, etc. So there are certain ways we can protect PPD. A few that I've mentioned here is first, pseudonymization. Pseudonymization basically means processing the personal data in a manner that personal data can no longer be attributed to a specific person. So for instance, there's a format preserving pseudonym that can be used for instance, a subject ID. If the subject ID was 1234, now it's 5678. There's no way to link to the original. We've preserved the format, but it's pseudonymized. The second is generalization. So generalization, we talk about this in terms of, let's say, medical history. So the terms are generalized to a higher level term or a system order class, so as to not be able to identify that person. And then the next is date offsetting, or another term that it's known by is fuse shifting in the industry. It essentially means that the dates are shifted by a certain degree to the anchor date. The anchor date could be the first day the first subject got the drug or when the patients got randomized. The fourth technique that I have here is randomization. As the name suggests, it simply replaces the original field value with a randomized number. And lastly, redaction. Redaction is the complete concealment of the identifier with an opaque box. Of course, it loses all inherent usefulness of the data by that box on top of it. The other information that that's exempt from disclosure is CCI. So according to the guidance that we have from EMA, it defines any information that is not in the public domain and where disclosure may undermine the legitimate interest of the applicant, that is considered a CCI. So if you look at the draft guidance, you'll see that there are certain categories that are, or certain things that are named as potentially being CCI, such as the quantitative compensation of the IP or the investigational product, the detailed information on the active substance that may be proprietary to a business. There could be future developmental plans that, if known to a competitor, could lead to a financial loss. And also, if there are any innovative analytical methods that were used for a clinical trial, that could be also considered CCI. Some things that are not CCI are general or administrative information. Any non-clinical information would not be CCI. And information that has no innovative features, something that's been used in the past, that is also not going to be CCI because that's not proprietary or not risky for business. We see that certain administrative documents, clinical, non-clinical documents can have CCI sprinkled around them. What we suggest as D&D service provider is if the piece of information that you think is CCI lies within these categories, we can identify that as CCI. However, if it's not those, then we have a flow diagram that we show to we walk our clients through. If you have a piece of information and you think that might be CCI, the first question we ask ourselves is that information available in the public domain? CCI information can be present on the company website, on clinical trials registries like the clinicaltrials.gov. It could be present in any scientific literature, even patent applications. There are a bunch of places where you can find this information publicly. If the answer to that is yes, then it's probably not a CCI. However, if you say if you're answering that as a no, the next question we ask ourselves is it important for economic interest for the company? If that information is leaked out into the public, would it lead to any financial advantage to a competitor? If the answer is no, likely not a CCI. However, if we say it's a yes, we ask that is it necessary for understanding the data? Information on methodology, information on dosing, PK models, storage, shipping, that kind of information is important for understanding the clinical trial itself. If the answer is yes, that might not be a CCI. However, if the answer is no, that could potentially be a CCI. One thing that we've learned from Policy 70 as well is that the sponsor needs to provide with adequate justification of what they consider a CCI. If you're able to provide that, we can for sure redact it or anonymize it as being CCI. So that was my little spiel on the regulation, as well as the scope and what we do in terms of transparency. We faced significant challenges with this new regulation that went live. I'm going to spend the first couple slides on what our impressions were of this new regulation and how we navigated our way through. EU CTR is still relatively new. We did expect since it went live, we did expect to have some hiccups along the way. Of course, sponsors as well as D&D service providers, we are navigating into this space cautiously. We have a lot of information that is provided by the EMA and also provided by people who are going through the process. It's scattered across, but what we've seen is that the guidance might not be very clear in contrast to the policy 70 guidance that we have. We've seen significant technical challenges in terms of the portal, the CTIS platform, and what we've seen has worked is a close collaboration between sponsors as well as the member states. Another area where we struggled were the timelines. The timelines are stringent, and I'm going to talk about, I have slides coming up for that as well later, and I'm going to talk about that. Also, with this regulation being new and requiring multiple documents right at the beginning of a CTA application, there's been considerable administrative overhead. And then, of course, the biggest challenge I feel is the deferrals and the lack of clarity on what that means, what documents can be deferred, etc. EMA has been very proactive in helping with these issues, with these challenges, but I'll go over each one of them individually. So people who've read the guidance, they know that the guidance, what we have right now is a draft guidance. So people who read it, they understand that it might be, there might be gaps in understanding. It's not as comprehensive as the well-established policy 70 guidance. And the guidance in itself recommends to be read in conjunction with policy 70 and policy 43. So that's something, as a T&D service provider, that's something we've taken to heart. And whether it's PPD or CCI, we look at policy 74 guidance. However, EMA has been more active. More recently, they've provided more information to sponsors in terms of Q&A documents, organization management service troubleshooting for CTIS users. They're conducting these troubleshooting sessions. There are CTIS webinars, there are walk-in clinics, there are also CTIS bite-sized talks that are available for people to watch. And then they're also answering questions live. Personally, I find the training modules that have been provided by EMA very helpful as well. They kind of walk you through the entire application process as well. Remember, this is still a voluntary submission this year. It becomes compulsory or becomes a mandate beginning January 2023. In our experience is that if you come across an area where there's a lack of clarity or you're unsure of what the answer is, go to the regulator, go to the agency themselves, and they will be able to help you and provide the correct feedback. So moving along, we also face significant technical challenges. So anyone who's been active on the EU CTR platform or the CTIS platform, they would know that there was a significant amount of downtime on the website. Eventually, there were some bugs that were found. There were some bug fixes, and everything went back live. But there was a time frame when the CTIS platform was unavailable. They also have maintenance windows as well, which are planned, of course. Whether planned or unplanned, be aware that CTIS platform may have downtime. One thing that we have learned is be proactive. Unfortunately, the CTIS platform being not available does not relieve the sponsors of their regulatory responsibility, the timelines, and that I'm going to talk about timelines in the next slide as well. But the timelines are stringent, and we will have to respond to requests for information by the EMA within that specific time frame. So be aware that that's a possibility that the CTIS platform may not be available, and plan accordingly, have a contingency plan. The next thing that we struggled at the beginning was the specific format of documents. So the documents are need to be uploaded in a specific format. The maximum allowed size is 10 MB as of now. So that's something to be aware of. Another issue that we came across was vendor database. In our experience, we found that the vendor database may not be very user-friendly. One of our partners we worked with in the past, they shared that the clinical trial sites and vendors need to be registered through an organization management service, or OMS for short, um, to enable them to use the CTIS platform. And there were issues that were identified um, in the way that OMS and CTIS are connected. So this allowed certain vendors to be added to the CTIS vendor list, or the CTIS vendor database, I should say. So that's something to be aware of. Ensure that you are, if you are a vendor, you are in the vendor database to begin with. The EMA is aware that these kind of issues are arising. They are taking action to optimize the CTIS platform, especially in the fourth quarter of 2022. The plan is to strengthen the platform. If there are any fixes, they are resolved. They're trying to identify any blocking issues before the CTR is mandatory in January of 2023. There were technical challenges, especially with larger multinational clinical trials, multi-member state clinical trial applications, and the EMA has provided us with workarounds to minimize that. Hopefully the idea is that before this transition period ends, EMA is able to find definitive solutions instead of those workarounds. Of course, this is a constantly evolving space. So I'm sure there's going to be more information as we go into the new year. In terms of timelines, so timelines have been a topic of discussion whenever a sponsor submits a clinical trial application in the CTIS. There is an evaluation process by the member states in accordance to the EU CTR. So the process basically decides if a proposed clinical trial is fit to be conducted or not. And there are two phases to that process. So first is the evaluation, first is the validation stage, and the second is assessment phase. In all, it's 60 days that the member states will evaluate within. And it can increase up to an additional 46 days, depending if there are any requests for information by the member states. In an initial CTA application, member states can request RFIs either during the validation or the assessment. Depending on when they raise those RFIs, the response timeline differs. So if it's a validation phase, it's going to be 10 days in which the sponsors need to respond in. If it's an assessment phase, the sponsors have 12 days to respond from the receipt of the RFI request. In addition to that, if there is an instance where response necessitates a change to a document, let's say, for instance, we have an IMPD or a protocol that needs to be changed, or there are minor fixes in it, the sponsor needs to provide a document, the fixed document, as well as the one with track changes. That's something that we learned along the way, something we didn't know before. So these are the things that we need to be cognizant of and plan proactively, because towards the end, we have timelines that are short. So if we can take action to ensure that we have high quality application in the first place, that would help us significantly. Another key challenge that we feel is something noteworthy is that to respond to a RFI in the 12-day period is very essential, because otherwise there's a risk of lapsing. There is no automatic notification that goes out to the sponsors. So the way it has worked for our sponsors is that they have a dedicated person who keeps check on the CTIS platform of the due date, because it won't prompt you or won't send any notification that the due date is close, and you need to submit that affected documents. So the regulation has also introduced challenges, like I mentioned earlier, in terms of the administrative overhead. The whole system changed fundamentally. Something which was historically decentralized is more centralized now. Previously, there were multiple data sources. They would get compiled into an application, and then there were local submitters for each country. Now all that has been compiled together in a single centralized CTIS submission. So of course, there can be up to 30 document types, up to 300 data elements that need to be that are required for a CTIS submission. There are folks that are involved from the clinical, the regulatory, the safety, quality, transparency side of things. And then, of course, there are CROs that are involved as well. So, of course, that has led to considerable administrative overhead. We as T&D service providers, in an ideal situation, we would want documents to come to us in a single group or a single bunch. But what we've seen is documents are provided to us in a rolling fashion as they get prepared. So that's obviously a challenge for sponsors, because especially if there's a time line when the RFI needs to respond in a certain time frame, like 10 days. So what we've seen is it's somewhat a controlled chaos. Documents may not be ready, they may trickle in, and what seems to work for us and for our sponsors as well is that a close collaboration, a close communication between the clinical team as well as the transparency and disclosure team, that works. That's worked for us in the past. We ensure that way expectations are met, and we know exactly what the timelines are, what the timeframes are, specifically when we talk about any RFIs that are raised. The next challenge that I have is about deferrals. What we know from the guidance is that deferral mechanism has been introduced to reduce the burden of redaction of CCIs by delaying the publication. So hopefully by that time, the CCI is not really a CCI and it's already mentioned in the public domain. Deferrable documents that are identified as per the draft guidance that we have is documents such as the subject information sheet, protocol, IMPD, sections S and E, as well as the IB. They are documents that can be deferred, provided that the sponsor can give a justification for why they need to be deferred. Again, this is one area where guidance is not clear as to what is an adequate justification. What we do know is that the justification is going to be in two parts. The first part is brief, and that's made available on the platform right away. But the second part will be made is more detailed justification of why something needs to be deferred, and that will be made available. Let's say if you're talking about an IB that's deferred for 7 years, it's going to be the second part of the justification will be made available in 7 years' time. Of course, there are certain timelines that differ for when the documents can be deferred for, and that varies. A point to note here is that EMA wants to capitalize on increased transparency on CTIS. So they are constantly encouraging sponsors to publish documents with redactions instead of going for deferrals. So that's something that we've seen. A few of the items that are going to be made public, even if they are deferred, are the EU clinical trial number, the sponsor's name, address, investigator's name, site addresses, nature of clinical trial, the decision that was made on that trial, all the relevant dates, as well as the CVs of investigators, statement regarding economic interests and institutional affiliations. These are the things that are going to be made public, even if the documents are being deferred. Of course, I've said this before, and I'll repeat. As we progress into the new year, we do expect more information to flow from EMA once this becomes a mandatory CTA, once this becomes more mandatory. And of course, this is an evolving area right now. So we'll hopefully get more information from the regulator, from the agencies. So a few of the tips and tricks that we've learned, tips and tricks of the trade that we've learned along the way. They've worked for us. Hopefully they'll work for you as well as you navigate your way through this. The first one is a question more so that we've been asked, and not really a tip there, but it's something that we've been asked by our sponsors frequently. We've been talking about transitioning trials and how in 2023, all CTA applications need to be through the CTIS platform. We know there are trials that are already ongoing under the directive, and they can continue to do so until January of 2025. But what happens if we need to add another member state to an ongoing trial? So if there is a member state that we need to add, we know that all new CTA applications after 2023 need to be through CTIS. So in that case, we will have to transition the trial onto the CTIS platform. And then as a second step of the process, we'll have to add that member state. So that's one thing that I wanted to highlight, a question that we get frequently asked. The second tip is something very simple, but often we see that the simplest of the things can be roadblocks down the lane, especially when we have stringent timelines. One account can be used by one person at a time. So if you have the same credentials and you're opening in multiple browsers, that wouldn't work. The next thing is the CTIS platform has a maximum file size of 10 MB. I believe I mentioned this in one of my previous slides as well. The document name length. Often we see with clinical trial documents, the name lengths are longer. There's only 100 characters that are allowed. So that's something to be aware of. We discussed that each document has two versions, a for publication and a not for publication version. Something that we learned while navigating through the actual application is that the system allows for upload of a for publication version, and then there's an icon to add, and then only it allows the second version, which is not for publication version, to be uploaded. So the first version is always going to be for publication. One of the training modules, I believe it was training module 12, that states sponsors can only submit personal data to CTIS to the extent that that is necessary to fulfill the responsibilities that are set out by the CTR. No data should be captured that is not needed. That kind of flows into my tip, like one of the tips here, improved document authoring and proactive redaction minimization approach. So the idea is that in the longer run, we improve the way we've written our documents or we've authored our documents to have minimal PPT and CCI from the beginning. So there is minimal redaction that's required. That's particularly helpful if we have RFIs in which we have to respond in 10 days and there are significant changes in the IMPD. if there's not enough CCI to begin with, that helps our time frame at that stage. So shorter, better defined timelines should push sponsors and CRO teams to think ahead and plan, and like all hands on deck strategy, and have more collaboration between the teams involved. So whether sponsors decide to jump into CTIS as early adopters, or you want to wait and see, January 2023 isn't far. If you're a sponsor who's looking to start their applications early in the year, reach out to your regulatory teams, reach out to your transparency and disclosure teams, internal stakeholders, to start that process. If you don't have that capability internally, reach out to external stakeholders and get help from experts as you navigate through the CTIS platform. That's it for my presentation. Suzanne, did we have any questions in the chat?
Thank you so much, Anaya, for that excellent presentation. Yes, we've got a lot of awesome questions that came in. So someone wants to know, do we need to adopt the same system for clinical trials for medical devices as per requirement of the MDR, or is there a separate system for regulating medical device clinical trials?
That is a good question. As far as I'm aware, there's a separate system for that. Unfortunately, I'm not entirely aware of the device category at this point, but I'll be happy to answer later.
Great. How firm is the Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. Someone wants to know, how firm is the approval schedule for each EU member state? When filing CTAs and amendments under the PASS system, some European countries would routinely ignore the due dates, sometimes taking 6 to 12 months to evaluate and approve an amendment with a 35-day approval cycle.
So what we know so far, the timelines are very stringent. What we've been told is that if we do not respond to an RFI within the 10 days or the 12 days, there's a risk of that trial lapsing. So as far as what guidance we have received is that we need to abide by it, even if the regulator is taking a longer time on their end. We need to respond to an RFI within that time frame.
Got it. That makes sense. Can sponsors delegate the submission to the CTIS portal completely to a CRO, or is there a portion or a section that has to be managed by a sponsor?
I believe you can you can have someone to work on this the CTIS platform for you, but I believe, as far as I'm aware, there's a role that you need to assign to that CRO. So yes, you can do that.
If you want to add new clinical trial sites, but not new countries, to an ongoing clinical trial under CTD, can you proceed with this amendment under CTD, or do you also need to transfer to CTR and CTIS?
Just making sure I understand that question, because I couldn't hear you at the beginning.
So they're talking about adding new clinical trial sites to a trial,
okay,
but not new countries. Yep.
Okay, fair enough. So that's actually a very good question. You cannot continue beyond 2025 under the directive if the clinical trial is being run in the European Union. So if there's a clinical trial that you're going to add within EU after the directive after 2025, that would not be possible. So you would need to transition. One thing that I would like to point here is the EMA wants us to carefully vet what trials need to be transitioned. So if there are any trials that won't have a new trial site, any trial which is going to be not continuing beyond 2025, that does not need to be transitioned. But if there's a new trial site, yes, we would need to transition that and then add a new trial site.
Got it. Are all documents intended for public consumption required at the time of initial application submission, or can the sponsor be required to request a deferral to submit redacted documents at a later date?
Yes, we can ask for a deferral. The deferral timelines, of course, they vary depending on there are multiple things that we've been provided in the guidance. There are two categories of trials. The trials have been divided into multiple categories. So the phase 1 trials are category 1 trials, phase 2 and phase 3 trials are category 2 trials. So they can be deferred, and there are specific documents that can be deferred only. They can be deferred for category 1, they can be deferred for up to 7 years. I believe for category 2, which are phase 2 and 3 trials, they can be deferred for up to 5 years. Again, something I mentioned in my presentation as well, it's the protocol, the subject information sheet, the IMPD, section S and E, and the IB, or the investigator's brochure. Those are the documents that are deferrable documents. I hope that answers that question.
I think so. Someone wants to know about your experience so far in getting your preferred regulatory agency to be selected to conduct the scientific review of your CTA.
I don't believe we have had experience with that. No.
Okay.
We did not, unfortunately.
Are you aware if the maximum document size requirement of 10 megabytes is going to be increased in the future?
Yes, it will be increased in the future. The if I'm correct, if I remember correctly, it's 50 MB. And that's something that's in the pipeline. That's something that's going to come. But for right now, and I know EMA is working actively on that. But for right now, it's 10 MB, and that's something to be aware of. But yeah, with initial CTAs, we don't really see documents that are bigger, larger than 10 MB right now. So that seems to work for right now. But when we have larger dossiers and we have clinical trial summaries, etc., that's when we'll hopefully we'll have that by then.
Okay, great. Someone wants to know, can you withdraw a submission to a member state prior to approval, prior to them basically making a decision? And if so, is this withdrawal status made public?
Yes to the first question. I believe you can withdraw an application. The withdrawals, if it hasn't been approved or it hasn't gone through the process, I believe it does not come out in the public. But again, I'll have to confirm that answer, and I can get back after this webinar.
Okay, fantastic. Someone is adding a kind of a follow-up question to the earlier question about timelines. Is the timeline binding to the member states? I understand that we need to keep to our timelines, but what about the EU member states?
As far as the guidance, so there are 2 phases, and we talked about that. It's 15 days for the first phase and 45 for the second. During the assessment period by the EMA, it can extend up to another 46 if in cases of RFI. So based on our understanding from that, I believe they have to abide by a certain time frame, but that's the information that we have so far. Again, this is still fairly new. We are navigating, we are learning as we go. It's an evolving area.
Got it. What about the requirement for transition? Does the clinical trial need to be complete in the EU in order to avoid transition? Do all the patients enrolled in that trial need to complete treatment?
So if it's going to run beyond 2025, it needs to be transitioned. If it's completed before that, it can stay. It can stay under the directive. If it's completed within anywhere in the EU, it can stay. If it's completed, but you need to submit clinical trial results, that can be done after of 2025, because we could for that part of the process doesn't change. One thing, and that's actually something I probably should have mentioned in my presentation as well. So that's a good point. It brings me to if the trial is running anywhere else globally, but it has ended in EU, we don't need to transition it onto the CTIS system, so it can continue as is. So thanks a lot for that question.
Excellent. We've got all sorts of really great questions here. It's great to see our audience so engaged. Someone wants to know if off-label use of drug regimens in conjunction with the investigational drug is considered unauthorized and require AXMPD.
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. We can think about it and get back to that person.
Okay.
How can collaborative study information be cross-referenced?
That's a good question. Again, I'm unsure of the answer to that.
No worries. Someone wants to know is substantial modification equivalent to an FDA IND amendment?
Can you repeat? You blanked out at the beginning.
Someone was asking about substantial modification and whether that's equivalent to an FDA IND amendment.
I'm unsure if it's equivalent to the FDA, but for a substantial modification, again, that would, if the trial is going to continue prior to, after 2025, we will need to transition that trial into the CTIS platform.
Great. Someone wants to know if antibody tests are considered in vitro diagnostics.
You need to repeat, Suzanne. Every time you unmute, I can't hear.
Okay. All right. Sorry. There's a little bit of it. Must be a little bit of a delay. Okay. Are antibody tests considered IVDs? In vitro diagnostics?
I'm unsure of that.
Okay.
Answer.
No worries. Are there any conditional requirements?
In terms of what? Like conditional requirements for what?
We might need some clarification from that question. I'll respond to that person. Can someone, okay, based on the available more than 100 clinical trials authorized through the CTS, what would you say is the average time it took for the application to go through to approval?
That's interesting. So based on the highlights that we've seen, that has varied for at least for this year. We've seen trials that took as little as 5 to 7 days, but then there were trials that took 60 days. So I think that goes on to say that not just the sponsors are learning to like the CTIS platform and the system and the regulation. EMA is also still not, it's not a set time frame that we see. We've received information on how many trials have been approved, how many trials application have gone through, and what we see is that the time frame, that timeline varies largely, at least for now. Hopefully, when this becomes a mandate, it's more strict. We have more clarity in terms of how much time frame the EMA or how long the EMA is going to take in responding and making a decision.
Great, thank you. Someone wants to know, when we create a new clinical trial and create the EU clinical trial number, the system asks us to add a name of the organization from the OMS. If we submit the study on behalf of the sponsor as a CRO, can we request an EU CT number and create a new trial using our organization name, or do we have to take the sponsor name from the OMS and link the EU CT number with the sponsor's name organization? That's a really long question. That might be a little beyond us.
So I think I can speak a little to that. So the OMS would have the vendor's name as well. That was the challenge that we faced. One of our partners, they mentioned they had a similar challenge. The name was not present, and I believe they had to get the member states involved and let them know that that's the issue they're facing, because that came on during the stage of RFIs, when there's a considerably shorter time frame to respond to. So I believe the answer to that question would be that you should be present in that vendor database. And of course, if you're not certain, then reach out to the agency themselves.
Great. Sorry, someone was asking that they were clarifying about the conditional requirements. They're saying, based on the new EMA clinical guidance, are there any conditional requirements to apply clinical trial records via ECTD? I'm not sure if that helps.
Nope.
No. Okay. All right. Looks like we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. During a RFI, can a sponsor commit to providing an updated document such as a protocol, or must they provide it during the query period? And if it does need to be provided, does it need to be signed?
What do they mean by the query period?
Okay, we can ask that person to clarify. Okay. Everyone's asking really great questions. Thank you so much, everyone. Last question on the OMS, and again, this might be beyond the scope of this presentation. Does the use of OMS imply that information is pre-populated?
Yeah, I'm unsure of that.
Okay, very good. Well, Anaya, thank you so much for this thorough and excellent presentation, and thank you so much to our audience for their attention and all their really fantastic questions. On behalf of Certara, I'd like to thank RAPS for hosting this event and wishing everybody a great day. This is the end of the webinar. Thanks so much.